Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, January the 8th, 2024. Hope you're doing well and your new year is off to a great start. If you have not yet, get on over to my Substack and get subscribed. I have switched my monthly newsletters over there to Substack, and I'm now writing fairly frequent posts, and I would love to connect with you over there. I'll have a link in the description. Well, today I was going to talk about boredom because today is the first day of classes at my university, and I saw a lot of bored faces as I walked down the hall. But I'm going to return to that maybe next week, because as I literally walked out my front door to take a walk and record the video on boredom, I heard the sound of running water, which of course is not something you want to hear in your front yard. And so I did a little checking and discovered that one of my pipes had burst. And so I have water that was spewing out of the pipe, connects to my irrigation system. And this led me to think about the reality of problems that we don't see. And in this case, had I not happened to walk by right then, there's no telling how long that water would have spewed and filled up the big hole where the sprinkler system is, and it caused all kinds of other problems. So I was able to shut the water off. I'll call a repair person and figure it out. This idea of problems that we don't see made me start thinking about the way that particular logics run as a kind of background for the way we navigate life. This is something that in particular Michel Foucault talks a lot about when he discusses the relationship between power and knowledge. What counts as knowledge, says Foucault, is anchored in the workings or the structures of our social power systems. In other words, it's the background logic that we can't see, by which we then live out our daily lives in ways that we tend to assume are just obvious. Everybody just knows this is the real world, this is how things work. And that claim to a kind of knowledge that is obvious and available to everyone then serves to reinforce a particular account of what is normal and what is normative. What gets to be credited as the way not only things are, but the way they ought to be in light of the way they are. Now, philosophers know that there's a traditional fallacy in moral theory called the naturalistic fallacy, where moving from an is to an ought, right? And the way things are to the way they ought to be is always going to be a kind of problem, that we don't necessarily get to go from one to the other easily. But in Foucault, what he's trying to suggest is not that we give in to the naturalistic fallacy, but that we become aware, that we become reflective and invested in attending to these structures that tend to lie behind the scenes. In other words, it's paying attention to what we normally ignore. In my case, this morning, it was being able to recognize that one of the pipes under the ground that I can't see without lifting up the, cover, that had an issue, and I had to address that issue. But I couldn't have understood that had I not heard the sound and then started trying to figure out where it was coming from. The same is true, says Foucault, in the way that things work in our society. Where do we find the pressure points, the issues that cause us to ask questions, that remind us that contingency is, in fact, the fabric of human existence? When we start to scratch at those spots, maybe we will then begin to understand that the particular way power functions to determine structures of what we then take ourselves to know might be otherwise. We could do things differently. Now, he suggests that this relation between power and knowledge is also something anchored in what he calls regimes of truth. And these are what I'm referring to as a kind of cultural logic. It's a framework by which what gets to count as true and therefore claimed as known is itself reflecting the very workings of that background logic. The stuff we cannot see runs behind the scenes. Now, lest we give into this as a kind of conspiracy theory sort of philosophical approach, This is not an argument about some sort of, political deep state standing back, intending certain sorts of outcomes, and all the rest of us are mere pawns. It's instead a narrative of the way that meaning functions in light of historical contingency. That things could be different is something that we don't tend to like to admit, because it disrupts those who have benefited from the way things have gone. So the way that Foucault wants us to think about this is not to become conspiratorial, not to give in to the dangers of such sloppy thinking, but instead to become aware, engaged, invested, and attuned to the fact that we often have choices that we don't admit, and that we tend to shut down possibilities in the name of just continuing a particular notion of the status quo. Power is not necessarily bad. The question is, how is that power deployed? Who benefits? Who is marginalized? How does this play out? And I tend to think that maybe the best way of understanding power in productive ways, appropriating Foucault for hopeful visions of the future, is to think about it as a kind of spurn toward critical engagement. If we realize that things are working a particular way, they could be otherwise, we then begin to think, what would it look like if we tried something else? When you walk out in your front yard and you hear water spewing, it might be the fact that there's a problem you can't see, so you need to do some digging. When you start recognizing that your society faces all kinds of problems with the way things are assumed to be, maybe we also should start doing that digging work as philosophers to interrogate the way things are, invite new options for how they could be, and then critically encourage each other to move into those spaces. In the same way that I'm going to call a repair person, we need to think together more rigorously about where we are and where we're going. Anyway, not quite the talk I had thought I would give today about boredom, but where I was today, philosophy for where we find ourselves, and I find myself today with a water leak in my front yard, and cultural logics operating behind the scenes in ways that often shut down our agency, our reflective ability, and our possible futures. I hope it's helpful. A little spontaneous reflection today. Have a great week. Again, connect with me over on Substack. Take care. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.